Welcome everybody to Reimagining Afro Latinidad. I'm saying this welcome, but who should really be up here saying this welcome is Walter. So let's give Walter a round of applause for doing a huge organizational and intellectual yeoman's job in bringing everyone to this space together to discuss these issues. I'm just going to say a brief introductory remarks and then hand the mic to Professor Segura, who will make some introductory remarks, and then we'll get the show started on the road. It's really great to see everyone here. What we're hoping for is an intimate, real, engaging conversation where we can have this discussion that we very much need to have. So we want you to feel like you're in a comfortable space where we can raise a lot of issues and questions and concerns. Okay? So I should introduce myself. I'm Samy Alim, Faculty Director of African and African American Studies. I'm sorry, there's that poll right in between. I see you though. I see you. Faculty Director of African and African American Studies, as well as the Institute for Diversity in the Arts. I'm a professor in education, by courtesy, anthropology, and linguistics, and these issues of race and ethnicity, particularly dealing with language and culture and music, are very important to me. I will say that this is a great opportunity for African and African American Studies to collaborate with Chicano Latino Studies as well, and Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, etc. So this is not just a theoretical sort of project and enterprise, but this is a practical and structural one as well, and I hope you feel that being in this room. So African and African American Studies comes to this project in conversation with Walter as we're currently undergoing this initiative entitled Race in Post-Obama America. Okay. New approaches to new problems in the new America. Okay, so it's a research, curricular, programmatic initiative to address these emerging problems. Race in Post-Obama America, if I can just say a few words, attempts to answer these fundamental pressing questions. How do issues of citizenship figure fundamentally into America's evolving racial dilemma and landscape? From the conservative denial of Barack Obama's status as an American, to heated debates over immigration reform, to mass efforts of racial profiling like New York Stop and Frisk, to the judicial assault on the Voting Rights Act, to the continued school closings in Black and Latino neighborhoods, to the illegal surveillance of Muslim houses of worship, to Black and Latino mass incarceration, to the dismantling of affirmative action, to the reemergence of neo-cultural poverty arguments, language gap arguments, achievement gap arguments. You would think that we lived in that gap, right? What are the implications for these interconnected struggles of communities of color? What are some emerging paradigms of race that meet the demands of America's new racial topography? Okay, these are some of the big questions, and to answer these questions and to think about the role of racialization in the United States, given America's rapidly changing demographics, what is needed in this new America is not just research that attempts to solve the enduring racial problems of the past, but rather new approaches to solve the emerging racial problems of the future, and not just problems, but of course, ways forward in terms of coalition building, collaboration, solidarity, co-solidarity, ally building, etc. Right? These are all we're at an important sort of nexus right now demographically. And I will leave off by saying that African and African American Studies is happy to be sponsoring the St. Clair Drake Lecture. If you're on campus on Wednesday, we're having a discussion about activism and racial justice in America with the legendary Harry Belafonte, who will be here, as well as Dream Hampton will be on campus. And so we really hope to continue these kinds of conversations next week. More than that, we hope to continue our collaboration with Chicano Latino Studies and CCSRE as we move forward. And with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Gaye Segura. Thank you.
First, let me say a quick word of thanks on behalf of the Chicano Latino Studies program to Walter for being the energy, the sometimes difficult to rein in energy behind this project. Walter will be hosting at least one conference a week for the remainder of his career. So please stay tuned. I'm sure you'll see the announcement. I also want to acknowledge on behalf of both AAAS and Chicano Latino Studies the support for the President's Fund for New Initiatives. The President's Office was generous in supporting Race in Post-Obama America and all of its component parts, including Afro Latinidad, and we're appreciative of that support. Walter received a founding grant for this conference from the Center for Latin American Studies, and I'm sure he's going to talk about that, but we appreciate their contribution as well. I'm going to ask you to engage in a bit of imagination that's going to be drawn from today's headlines. Now, some of you may have read that an Anglo-American rancher in Nevada has staged a bit of an armed revolt against the United States government, from which the government, for reasons that escape me entirely, backed down. But we've learned a fair amount about this activist, whose surname is humorously and appropriately Bundy, calling to mind both the anti-hero Al Bundy of Married with Children and the serial killer Ted Bundy, and maybe that's just for my amusement. But I want you to imagine for a moment, we've discovered today and yesterday that Mr. Bundy has a number of opinions about the world. For those of you who are Latino in the room, he really likes Mexicans, so that's all good. He's not as crazy about African Americans, and specifically, he says that blacks have become dependent on the government, says a man who's grazed his cattle on federal land for 21 years without paying for it. So the lack of self-awareness here is profound. But in drawing on Professor Alim's theme about race in post-Obama America, I'm going to connect you to another headline in today's paper and try to bring you into an imaginary world, because I think it's going to inform you. So African American and Latino students in the state of Michigan have fully, finally, and completely been barred from state institutions through the instrument of affirmative action, thanks to the United States Supreme Court. Imagine, if you will, that black and brown students occupied a piece of state land, not federal land, and that hundreds of black and brown activists rushed to their side, armed to the teeth with automatic weapons. How does that end? I'm guessing differently. I'm also reminded, by the way, not to leave gender out of the conversation, the Bundy group had the plan to use women as human shields. So let's give credit where credit's due. They're going to hit all the top issues. So with that as a background, I think we're in this really weird moment in American racial life. It is almost as if we have stepped through the looking glass. And the willingness of people to say things and to do things that for a generation were socially unacceptable, even in the most socially backward environments, is actually quite shocking. And so I think the type of work that we do and the study of race in this post-Obama America is going to be critical. And so I'm happy to be part of that. I'm happy that all of you are part of that, and just to recognize that our work is quite large. Now, in terms of today's topic, we have structured this Afro-Latinidad topic to be simultaneously two things. First, a discussion of black and brown relations. And secondly, a discussion of racial identification as it pertains to black and brown bodies, some of whom are descended from Latin American nations, because Afro-Latinidad is an identity of itself, as well as a description of intergroup politics and social relations in the United States. I think those questions are intimately connected, and anyone who studied history in Latin American societies, history of European and indigenous populations interacting, mixing successfully and unsuccessfully, European and African-derived populations in other parts of Latin America doing the same, understands that race and the conceptualization of race in Latin America is being revisited over and over again here in the United States for both African-American and Latino, and people who are otherwise identified as African-American or Latino despite how they might identify themselves. And so these questions, I think, are very intimately connected. The second thing that I want to point out is that Latino racial identity is evolving. From 1970 until 2000, the percentage of Latinos who identified as white went down linearly. So that by the 2000 census, only a little bit more than a third of Latinos self-identified their racial identity as white. I should tell you that Hispanicity is a separate question from racial identity in the census, at least up until now. It's likely to change in the near future. So what does Latino whiteness mean, and why was it declining? Perhaps more interestingly, why did Latino whiteness recover in the 2010 census? Don't think we have a really good answer for that, but the percentage of Latinos who identify as white on the census went up in 2010 after having gone down over the course of 4 censuses in a row. I could speculate as to why I think that's the case, but again, what constitutes Latino racial identity is constantly evolving. It also is deeply imbued with questions of class, and folks who understand racial hierarchies in Latin America will tell you that the way we understand race in the United States, which is deeply contingent on phenotype, on the perceptions of skin tone, those things can be overwhelmed in the Latin American environment by social class, or the old phrase, money whitens. Finally, there's this question of black-brown relations in the United States, and we're going to talk about those a number of times today, and I just want to give a little caveat. And the caveat is, I hope we can remember that black-brown relations function in the United States at both the mass and the elite level. So when we're trying to ascertain whether or not African Americans and Latinos are enjoying moments of cooperation or moments of contestation, what's true among office holders or leaders of community-based organizations may not be true at the street level. And I think that we want to recognize that a healthy intergroup relationship somewhere down the line is going to be contingent on both of those relationships functioning in a progressive and constructive fashion, rather than in a competitive one. So those are the opening remarks I have to welcome you all here, and on behalf of Chicano Latino Studies, I really appreciate your presence. So with that, I'm going to introduce Walter, and he will get the day started. Walter.
Hi everyone, I'm actually speaking at the end, but Chris Vasquez will be introducing Casey Nichols right now.
So Casey Nichols received her master's in history from the University of Washington, Seattle in June 2009. She graduated magna cum laude from California State University, Long Beach in 2007 with a BA in history. Her research interests are African American, urban, and Mexican American history. She started her PhD at Stanford in 2009 and is currently writing her dissertation. The title of Casey's talk today is Race and Poverty in a Multi-Ethnic City, Black-Brown Relations in 1960s Los Angeles. Her paper frames Los Angeles as a multi-ethnic urban center and offers the opportunity to move beyond the black-white paradigm that has tended to shape studies of race relations in the US. More specifically, her research looks at the implementation of the war on poverty in Los Angeles to examine how the federal, state, and local government confronted the complex nature of race relations in a multi-ethnic setting. In doing so, she interrogates the impact that the emphasis on black-white relations has had on shaping the relationship between African Americans and Mexican Americans during the 1960s and 1970s.
Hello, thank you all for coming. I'm just going to set up a little bit here. Thanks to Walter for organizing this conference. I'm really excited to be here. There we go. Okay, again, thanks to you all for coming to hear us talk to this question of Afro-Latinidad and Black-Brown relations. As Chris stated, I'm a PhD student here in the history department studying under Al Camarillo. I'm currently writing my dissertation on the war on poverty in LA and Black-Brown relations as it relates to that topic. And my dissertation is entitled Equal Opportunity Politics, Race Policy, and Grassroots Organizing in Multi-Ethnic California. And I first came to this topic as an undergraduate student, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to be able to examine this topic in more detail as a PhD student. And so what I wanted to do for you today is to provide an overview of some of the key themes and some of the key questions that I explore in my dissertation project. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with the War on Poverty, it was a set of reforms that was passed under President Lyndon B. Johnson. And what set the War on Poverty into motion was the passage of the Economic Opportunity Act in August of 1964, which allocated federal funding and set the guidelines for the administration of the War on Poverty. And so the central component of the program would be to develop programs at the state and the municipal level for personal and community rehabilitation. And some of those programs would include from child care to employment training to community revitalization. So the goal was to really tackle the roots of what was considered locally based poverty. And so I chose to conduct research on the War on Poverty and to write about the War on Poverty in particular because it's a really rich topic for considering the relationship between African Americans and Mexican Americans from a historical perspective specifically. Because the War on Poverty emerged during an interesting era in African American and Mexican American history. Specifically, we see the rise of the War on Poverty during an era of what would be the height of the African American Civil Rights Movement, such as we see with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And again, the War on Poverty is passed in 1964. And then also in terms of thinking about the rise of the Chicano movement, we really see sort of the burgeoning in the early stages of what will become the Chicano movement in 1968 through an examination of the War on Poverty. And so some of the central themes that I explore when going back, right, that we see the War on Poverty at the height of the Black Civil Rights Movement and then at the rise of the Chicano movement. Secondly, one of the major characters that I explore in my research in terms of thinking about Black-Brown relations is President Lyndon B. Johnson. And what makes him interesting is that he has this long history with the Mexican-American population that other federal officials and even presidents didn't have. So you really see with Johnson this effort to try to grapple with how to develop a set of racial policies that considers groups beyond this black-white paradigm that scholars have examined and have discussed in terms of thinking about creating a more inclusive way of understanding and examining history. Third, one of the other major themes is considering the broader history of Los Angeles in the West. So in comparison to other locations, other major cities such as Chicago and New York, right, Los Angeles is the space that has this long multi-ethnic history, and the West broadly has a more complicated history in terms of race in comparison to other major urban cities. And also, Los Angeles, along with major cities like Chicago and New York, is one of the most funded cities under the War on Poverty. So that also makes it interesting for considering Black-Brown relations, right, in the space in which the federal government provided this sort of similar levels of funding that it would provide for a city characterized by Black-Brown relations in particular. Okay, so why don't we talk about some of my research questions? So my research seeks to interrogate factors such as spatial arrangement, racial identity, federal politics, and how these factors shape Black-Brown relations around the War on Poverty. And so one question is, in what ways did the War on Poverty bring African Americans and Mexican Americans into closer proximity? And by closer proximity, I'm referring to moments such as collaboration, conflict, and even constellation. An example of what we might consider collaboration is the development of an organization known as the Community War on Poverty Committee, which brought together a coalition of African American and Mexican American politicians and activists who sought to make the Black and brown population of Los Angeles the key administrators of the program. An example of what we may consider conflict is once the war on poverty comes to LA in a more sustained way, and you start to see more of an emphasis on African Americans and the disbursement of money, Mexican Americans then start to consider or work toward developing separate programs so that they may have more opportunities for leadership or even more access to the programs if they're locally based. And so that would be sort of an example of some of the conflict that we start to see emerging around the war on poverty. And a second question that I explore is how did the local, state, and federal government approach racial inequality in a multiracial space such as Los Angeles? And as I mentioned before, other major cities such as places like Chicago really has this long history of Black-white relations, and it becomes the norm in debates about racial inequality in the US in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And so one point of negotiation in the relationship between African Americans and Mexican Americans is the fact that Mexican Americans are often left out of this conversation. And what happens in the 1960s as the Chicano movement starts to take off is that Mexican Americans start to rally for greater inclusion into these conversations. And specifically going back to Lyndon B. Johnson, again, Mexican Americans recognize him as someone who has this long history as being part of understanding some of the issues that Mexican Americans have experienced, specifically through his career, early political career in Texas, and also during the Kennedy era in which Mexican Americans were brought into the Kennedy administration through Lyndon Johnson. And so speaking of LBJ, why don't we talk a little bit about him? And so again, in my research, I interrogate, well, how did LBJ contribute to or factor into Black-brown relations on a national scale in the 1960s and 1970s? And again, he's interesting because he has, starting with his early political career, he has this long history of rallying as much as he can the Black and brown vote from his time in Texas as a local politician. And something that many don't know about Johnson is that he started his early career as a teacher and a principal at, at Cotulla, in Cotulla, Texas, at a segregated Mexican-American school. And so it's there that he really starts to, or at least from what he says later on, it's there that he really starts to understand what racial inequality looks like and how groups are excluded and not receiving the types of funding that other populations receive. He also had one-on-one experience with Mexican Americans when he was elected the head of the National Youth Authority of the state of Texas, where he worked with Mexican American youth in the 1930s. And then if we flash forward to the 1960s, what LBJ is often known for, if I can, is the legislation that he passed that's tied to the sort of momentous moments of the African American Civil Rights Movement. And here we see him signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the following year will be the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And so again, these are examples of how Johnson is immersed in these two history between these two populations. And that's really what sets him apart and why I think, at least I think, he's an interesting actor in examining this history of, broader history of Black-brown relations and the historical relationship between African Americans and Mexican Americans. And what's also interesting in terms of thinking about 1960s and the passage of these significant pieces of civil rights legislation is that Johnson actually tended to invoke his experiences with Mexican Americans as he was proposing the legislation and describing why it was significant. And I have a quote from Johnson when he actually announced the Voting Rights Act in 1965. This is what he had to say. Quote, "So we want to open the gates to opportunity, but we're also going to give all our people, Black and white, the help that they need to walk through those gates. My first job after college was as a teacher in Cotulla, Texas, in a small Mexican-American school. Few of them could speak English, and I couldn't speak much Spanish. My students were poor, and they often came to class without breakfast and hungry. And they knew, even in their youth and pain and prejudice, they never seemed to know why people disliked them. But they knew it was so because I saw it in their eyes. So as we can see here, right, in Johnson's speech to propose the Voting Rights Act, again, which is seen as a significant moment in African American history, he turns to his past with Mexican Americans to describe how he understands and what he's seen as a development of racial inequality in the U.S. And my research explores the ways in which the Johnson era opened up a moment of possibility for a more expansive approach to examining and understanding racial inequality in the U.S. beyond the black-white relations model, because of this tendency that he had to place the black and the brown experience in a conversation. And even though the Johnson era created this moment of possibility, at the local level, things became a little bit more complicated. And so one of the challenges of black-brown collaboration in Los Angeles in particular around the war on poverty was that war on poverty funding did not enter LA in a more sustained way until the Watts Rebellion of 1965. Often described as the Watts Riot, this mid-1960s African-American uprising took place August 11th through the 15th of 1965, where African-Americans in Watts looted local businesses, set buildings on fire, and fought back against police forces as a result of the unequal treatment that they received from the city. And one of the outcomes of the rebellion, as I mentioned, was that it really helped to loosen up funding, war on poverty funding for Los Angeles. And as a matter of fact, the federal government even made funding LA a top priority after the Watts Rebellion occurred. And much of that funding was actually made available specifically for the African American community as a result of needing to sort of clean up the mess as a result of, such a large-scale rebellion being broadcast internationally. And so through my analysis of the war on poverty, I interrogate this tendency to emphasize African Americans, and again, what that would mean for a space like Los Angeles, in which both African Americans and Mexican Americans make up a significant proportion of the poor population. And so at the local level, it's also important to consider the relationship between race and urban space when examining racialized experiences in cities following World War II. Because specifically, once war on poverty funding entered LA, the spatial arrangement of the city actually shaped the ways in which African Americans and Mexican Americans interacted around the program. So while Black Americans and Mexican Americans could be found in the same neighborhoods prior to World War II, the post-war period saw an increase in residential segregation in Los Angeles. And African Americans became primarily concentrated into the South Central region, which we see here. And Mexican Americans became concentrated into the eastern portion of the city, which we see over there. And you can also see that Mexican Americans are actually a little bit more spread out, which reflects their more complicated racial history in comparison to African Americans. And oftentimes conversations and debates about Black-Brown relations center around this assumption in this conversation that African Americans and Mexican Americans are or should be natural allies and naturally recognize their similarities to one another. However, I argue that if we consider the reality of residential segregation in a place like post-war Los Angeles, then you really start to see the development of political, social, and cultural borders as they align with residential borders. And so in terms of thinking about this question of natural allies, first, African Americans and Mexican Americans must talk to each other across residential borders in order to be able to seriously consider their differences or their similarities from one another. An example would be, in terms of the development of war on poverty programs, there was also this toward the later part of the 1960s, a tendency to develop distinct programs, a set of programs for the Black community in South Central and Watts, and then the development of programs for Mexican Americans in East LA. An example of that would be two long-standing programs that are actually still in existence. The first is called the Watts Labor Community Action Committee, which still exists, and then the program that was created, that same program that was created for Mexican Americans, the East Los Angeles Community Union, which, as I stated, both of these programs still exist today, but were created with the same funding pool, the same goals in mind. And again, the Mexican American version of the program was actually created so that Mexican Americans could have access to the same set of resources like African Americans did. And that's one way that we can see how the war on poverty interacts with race and urban space and post-war LA. Another factor is the reality of racial identity politics. The natural allies thesis sometimes prevents us from examining the ways in which the racial identity, racialization processes that African Americans and Mexican Americans experience have some interesting distinctions. And so here we have some pamphlets from two federal government conferences. The first, as you can see, is for Mexican Americans, and then the second is for African Americans. So again, you see this tendency of the development of two distinct relationships with the federal government, two distinct political relationships. And again, both of these conferences have a relationship to the war on poverty. And so racial identity politics were also central to Black-Brown relations because, again, of the development of separate anti-poverty agencies. And even though African Americans and Mexican Americans have similar histories and experiences, their histories, as I mentioned, are not identical. And central to Black-Brown relations within the context of the war on poverty was that African Americans and Mexican Americans desire to maintain a level of racial uniqueness, even if they did attempt to come together in collaboration or mutual understanding. For instance, in a session at the Cabinet Committee hearings on Mexican American Affairs in 1967, Lionel Castillo of the Neighborhood Centers Association of Houston, Texas, spoke about what he identified as inter-minority relations. And he attempted to grapple with this question of differences and similarities. And what he argued was that the culture of poverty thesis and the idea behind the culture of poverty was something that African Americans and Mexican Americans shared. Right? They were both equally impacted by residential segregation, a lack of educational resources, a lack of full access to the political system. But he argued that both populations differed culturally, and he wanted to, consider, well, how can groups work together while also acknowledging their distinctiveness. And here's the Cabinet Committee hearings on Mexican American Affairs, and this is what Castillo had to say. There are other strong cultural forces that distinguish the two groups from each other and from the Anglo. The Mexican American is Roman Catholic. The Negro is Baptist Protestant. The Mexican American has deep roots in the Southwest. The Negro is a more recent arrival. The Mexican American woman is supposed to concern herself only with domestic and church affairs. The Negro and Anglo women have more freedom to participate in civic affairs. The Mexican American has strong kinship ties to his relatives, both near and far. The Negro does not. The Mexican American places high value on his machismo. The Negro does not. And so as we see in this quote, right, you see this sort of grappling with this attempt to maintain this idea of a race cultural distinctiveness that's tied to race, but at the same time also trying to bring African Americans and Mexican Americans into conversation about issues of racial inequality, with tying them to the cultural poverty pieces, which again has some concerns that could be further examined. And so efforts to develop this balance between commonality of experiences and uniqueness also greatly shaped Black-Brown relations during the 1960s and the 1970s. And this is one of the topics that I try to explore in depth throughout the course of my dissertation, along with the relationship between race and urban space, the tendency to emphasize African Americans, and the role of the federal government in shaping Black-Brown relations. and I'll continue to sort of, work through these questions in my work in progress on my dissertation. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please go ahead.
Thank you, Casey. Hi, I'm Vanessa, and I'm going to be introducing Sylvia Zamora. Sylvia Zamora is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology at the University of California in Los Angeles. Her research broadly examines how Latino immigration is transforming social, political, and racial dynamics in American society, and how these changes are creating new challenges and opportunities for civic engagement. Her work has been recognized with awards from the American Sociology Association sections on the international migration and racial and ethnic minorities. Her published work on multiracial coalition building and immigrant rights, framing discourse of peers in Latino studies, and the edited volume of Just Neighbors, research on African American and Latino relations in the United States. Sylvia will be presenting a paper titled Racial Remittances, the Effect of Migration on Racial Ideologies in Mexico. Her talk today examines how racial ideologies in the United States are circulated back to the immigrant sending community via interpersonal contact between U.S. immigrants and non-migrants, individuals who have never left their home society. Drawing on in-depth interviews with Mexicans in Mexico and the U.S., she shows how immigrant perceptions of Black Americans are transmitted to non-migrants, illustrating a phenomenon she identifies as racial remittances, or the movement of racial discourses and stereotypes across national borders. Whereas recent scholarship has documented immigrants' preference to maintain social distance from Blacks, her finding challenges assumptions that these attitudes are a product of the U.S. incorporation process. Rather, her research suggests that Mexicans begin to engage with anti-Black U.S. discourse and schemas long before migration. Please welcome Sylvia Zamora.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. And I just want to announce that I am defending my dissertation next Friday, and I finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm very excited about that. Okay, I'll get started. Just a little bit about the motivation for my study. Professor Segura made a point about crazy headlines. And I can bet that probably every one of you in here at one point or another has read or seen newspaper headlines about the alleged sort of race war between Blacks and Latinos. In 2007, there was an LA Times article, and the headline was Roots of Latino and Black Anger. And in this article, the author said, it should not be surprising that migrants from Mexico and other areas of Latin America and the Caribbean arrived to the U.S. carrying the baggage of racism. Now, this was an article that was attempting to explain, right, this so-called anger and violence between the communities. And although the existence of anti-Black prejudice in Latin America has been widely acknowledged by scholars, we know less about how ideas about race travel with immigrants across borders, or how these conceptions change in the process of incorporation to U.S. society. Now, let me just briefly highlight, very generally, some of the key points about race in Latin America and the U.S. Now, most of us are familiar with the U.S. and the rigid black-white binary, and the United Latin America has been characterized mostly as sort of a continuum of racial categories. And in this case, somebody who is, a person with African ancestry here in the U.S. would be identified as Black, goes to Latin America, right, and may not be necessarily viewed as Black. In addition, some nations in Latin America, meanings of Blackness vary, but also at the national level, some nations embrace it such as Cuba, while others negate it or ignore it. And Mexico is one example of that. Now this brings me to my broad research question, which is how does migration facilitate the travel of racial ideologies across national boundaries? And how are Mexicans' conceptions of blackness transformed in the migration process? And I'm interested specifically, what are the consequences of this for intergroup relations between Mexican immigrants and Black Americans here in the US? Now, I want to give a little bit of more specific background on the Mexican racial context. Mexico is characterized as an Indo-Mestizo nation, where the primary social distinction is that between the indigenous and the Mestizo populations. Now, we all know that Mestizo refers to the mixture between Spaniard and indigenous. In Mexico, that is a way, sort of the symbolism for the quintessential Mexican. Now, unlike countries with large Afro-descendant populations, such as Brazil or Cuba, the Mestizo in Mexico really does represent sort of the Mexican racial identity. Yet the image of the ideal Mestizo places an emphasis on the European element. Now, during Mexico's nation-building project after independence from Spain, it was assumed that Black Mexicans had disappeared as a result of increasing racial mixture. So although mestizaje can really, mean the mixture of different groups, in Mexico, the Black element has been largely ignored, and there's a lot of literature on this. Now, what happens when immigrants come to the US? Some immigrants expect to find sort of this, this is an image of Anglo-America that is exported globally. This picture always makes people laugh, it's sort of like the image that we see of Anglo-America, the nuclear white family. For most Mexican immigrants who come, especially to Los Angeles and throughout California, this isn't the reality that they encounter. In fact, there's a lot of multiracial and ethnic diversity, and in Los Angeles specifically, Mexican immigrants have been coming into increasing proximity to Black Americans. And I'm sure most of you are aware that now in many parts of South LA, Latinos make up the majority. So nationally, Latinos have surpassed African Americans as the largest minority group, and the dominant paradigm of the Black and white racial binary is being challenged by this growing presence of Latinos. And demographers project that the US will soon become a majority-minority nation. That by the year 2060, minorities will comprise over half of the US population. And traditionally, social scientists have studied relations between the dominant white and white group and Blacks. These fundamental changes in US race relations is leading to growing scholarly attention to relations between minority groups, and particularly African Americans and Latinos as the two largest minority groups. Now, a new debate is emerging in the literature about where the US color line will be drawn and on which side of this line Latinos will fall. And central to this conversation are questions about how Latinos will position themselves racially vis-a-vis African Americans. And thus far, studies of Latino and African American relations tell us that Latinos, particularly immigrants, tend to show a preference for maintaining social and racial distance from Blacks. And there are two competing hypotheses to explain this pattern, and the first is the post-migration hypothesis, right? And this suggests that immigrants come to the US and they learn anti-Black racial attitudes and behaviors from whites. And the second, or the pre-migration hypothesis, which is something like what the LA Times article was referring to, is that Latin America is racist and anti-Black, and immigrants merely bring this, quote-unquote baggage of racism with them. And although these studies have made important contributions, most have taken a nation-oriented approach, focusing almost exclusively on the host society, so that is race relations and racial attitudes in the US, limiting the attention to Latino immigrant experiences with race and racialization after they've migrated. So questions about whether Latino immigrants' racial views originate in their home country or in the post-migration experience or some combination of both remains somewhat under-theorized in the social science literature on Latinos and racialization. Now let me just get through the lit review section pretty quickly, but it frames the findings. So my dissertation attempts to intervene in this literature by maintaining that to understand how Latino immigrants construct meaning about race and navigate racial encounters in the US, it requires a transnational framework that takes into account both the sending and the receiving societies, as well as how racial ideologies travel with individuals across borders and are reconfigured in the process of immigrant incorporation. Most recently, some scholars have begun to examine race as a central focus, so sort of merging the literature on transnationalism and race. And they show that indeed migrants transmit racial ideologies that impact how individuals construct meaning about race, about identity, how they racially classify themselves and others, both in their new country, but also when they sort of send these messages back to their context in the home country. So a little bit about the data and methods. I conducted a multi-site qualitative study drawing on 75 in-depth interviews that were conducted between June 2010 and January 2012 with a cross-section of Mexicans. So 30 non-migrants in Guadalajara, Jalisco. And these are people who have never lived abroad, and if they've traveled abroad, no more than 3 months. And also 15 recent immigrants who have 3 years or less in the US, and 30 long-term immigrants with 10 years or more. And these interviews were conducted in Los Angeles in various neighborhoods. And the data, so this data is collected at one point in time for Mexicans. You know, ideally I would have sort of followed the individuals in Mexico and sort of followed them as they migrated, but that wasn't too feasible. So this is the best I can do, you know, identify these three groups. Okay, so to get to the findings. So many of you are familiar, possibly, if not, now you are, Memín Pinguín. He is Afro-Mexican character, hugely popular in Mexico, featured in a comic book series that was first published in the 1960s. He's perhaps the most famous black character in Mexico. And as you can see from this image, he's stereotypically depicted as a poor and mischievous boy with exaggerated physical features. And his mom, who isn't in this image, but she resembles an Aunt Jemima mammy type. So I asked respondents a series of questions about Memín to understand how they perceive blackness in the Mexican context. And when asked whether Memín was Mexican, Carmen replied, "It seems like he was Mexican. I don't know. I never thought about it. But logically, well, you think he's Cuban or American." And so what this shows is that for many respondents, you know, Memín is black, phenotypically, physically, but many hesitated to affirm that he was also Mexican. And scholars of blackness in Mexico report similar findings, referring to this as an example of the denial of African ancestry in Mexico. And a few years ago, there was a major controversy that ensued when the Mexican government issued a commemorative postage stamp of Memín. And many African-American leaders here in the US took this as a ridiculing of blacks, pointing out the similarities to Memín's caricature image, and like the type that you might see in the minstrel shows. And this widespread adoration of Memín throughout Mexico, for many, especially in the US, symbolizes Mexico's anti-black racism, right? In Mexico, this is not the way that a lot of people perceive Memín. They sort of take it as, you know, it's sarcasm, it's a joke. Some people may even say that there's nothing racist about Memín. Now, in their daily lives, Mexicans have very limited interactions with blacks, and especially in the field site where I was, and in the state of Jalisco, which is in western Mexico, central western Mexico. And actually, I should note, the reason why I selected this region to do the interviews is because a lot of the Mexican immigrants who come to Los Angeles especially tend to have origins in that region of Mexico. So in order to do this kind of a comparative transnational study, I sort of wanted to make sure that it was sort of what some scholars call the mainstream mestizo population. So I didn't do interviews with Afro-Mexicans or indigenous Mexicans from southern Mexico, for example. So there, in that context in Mexico, there are very limited encounters and interactions with black people. And the majority of respondents had actually never encountered a black Mexican, and several were not even aware of their existence. So when I asked specifically, are you familiar with black Mexicans? Some would say, well, I've seen some, but in Puerto Vallarta, the beach areas, I think they're tourists, but they're not Mexican. Okay, so just to summarize that section, sort of the racial context in Mexico, I find that in Mexican national discourse, blackness is nearly invisible, right? And this can be contrasted to the U.S. Very generally, where blackness and blacks as a group are hypervisible and an integral part of the nation in terms of racial ideologies and practices, including the institutionalization of exclusionary racial policies. And also in terms of the dominant stereotypes of blacks, they also vary from generally non-threatening in Mexico, think of Menin, to physically threatening, aggressive, and at times violent in the US context. How then do Mexicans construct meaning about black Americans specifically prior to migrating and after they've experienced direct encounters with blacks in the US? And for some, this is the first time that they're actually interacting with blacks, and especially in parts of South LA, where some Mexican immigrants settle upon arrival. Now, another main finding in my study is that Mexicans are exposed to US racial ideologies long before they migrate, largely as an effect of racial remittances. And sociologist Peggy Levitt, who studies international migration, coined the term social remittances to refer to the norms, practices, and values that circulate between immigrants in the US and their home countries. My work builds on this concept by providing a systematic analysis of racial remittances, or the racial ideologies, stereotypes, and experiences with race that immigrants acquire in the US and then transmit back to their country of origin. And in examining racial remittances that are sent back to Mexico via the interpersonal ties between immigrants and their friends and family who remain in Mexico, I sort of asked them a series of questions about the type of contact that they have. And it's mostly, phone, some return migration, some visits back home for the holidays, and in one case, a person in Mexico had visited family in LA. Now, specifically, I find that the stories that immigrants communicate back to Mexico tend to reflect US-based anti-black ideologies that characterize blacks as aggressive, criminal, and at times violent. And these racial remittances tend to emphasize a fear of blacks and function as a warning of sorts, cautioning immigrants to keep their distance from blacks upon arriving to the US. And I also find that racial remittances are reinforced when traveling through multiple pathways. So the messages that an uncle will transmit to his niece are reinforced by the media images, Hollywood films, that also transmit racial stereotypes. So for example, these anti-black stereotypes that were remitted to Mexico through Hollywood films featuring black actors in stereotypical roles and scenes of the urban ghetto or the plighted black communities, as well as from personal contact with US immigrants. Here, Carmen, who's a housewife in Guadalajara, explains, well, first, because I would see it in movies. Well, one thinks that they're like that, right? But it proved to me that they do have strong personalities, because I would see it in the movies that they would beat each other up, and that they're very impulsive, and from what my brother tells me about how they fight in Dallas, well, it proved to me that what I was seeing on TV was also reality. Okay, and so, you know, I just wanted to point out here, you know, it's the messages and the media together, similar stereotypes really reinforce this image of Black Americans. In few cases, racial remittances were based on direct encounters between immigrants and Blacks, although these were few, and I'll make a point about this in a second. But take, for example, Martin. As we entered a discussion of race in the US, Martin quickly referenced a conversation that he had with Juan regarding Juan's first experience with Black people in Sacramento. So Juan is Martin's best friend. He migrated to Sacramento 7 years prior. And he said, well, Juan told me, I ran into a little group of Black guys when I was walking down this street and they beat me. One day the neighbors even broke into Juan's place to rob them, and that's why they had to move location. I had that conversation with him and he told me that it was too many problems living with Blacks because they look at you as if they don't like you. And Martin was sure to point out that this happened to Juan as soon as he arrived to the US. And then he remarked sarcastically, well, they gave him a nice welcome. Right? So he commented that Juan had previously mentioned frequent conflict with his Black neighbors. But what I want to point out here is that you notice that one encounter that Juan had with these guys that, you know, he says beat him up, that one encounter led to these generalized stereotypes about Blacks in general. And although Martin, like the majority of non-migrants in Mexico, had never visited the US, he's able to draw from these transnational exchanges to paint a portrait of what it must look like to live among Blacks in Sacramento in this case. However, what was really interesting about this data is that respondents tended to very rarely challenge these types of racial remittances. Why? Because they've never been to the US, so the stories that their immigrant relatives are relaying back are often taken as accurate, as truth, right? How can I challenge what you're telling me if I've never lived it? I don't really know the US. So it's sort of they're not challenged very much. In some cases, the media actually is challenged. There were actually some respondents who would say things like, well, we know that Hollywood films, they exaggerate, so what do I know if that's really what it's like in the US? Now, one more example. These racial remittances also serve to transmit racial knowledge about race relations more broadly, including white on Black racism. And Miguel here, who is in his late 20s and lives in Guadalajara, he explains, from what my cousins told me, that an African American gets along better with a Latino than with a gringo, white American. Because they told me that I think before there was more slavery of Blacks by whites, and I think that's why they're resentful or angry with the gringos. African Americans don't have anything against Mexicans. They just want to be treated fairly by the gringos, whites, so they have problems with them. And here we see how Miguel came to understand US racial dynamics through his cousin's interpretation of the effect of slavery on African Americans, right? And indeed, some respondents had heard some version of how Blacks were quote unquote resentful because of this history of slavery, and this was usually interpreted as racial conflict between Blacks and whites, not necessarily between Blacks and Mexicans. But note that this interpretation nonetheless depicts African Americans as angry and aggressive, right? So that did come up often. Carla, who's a housewife in Guadalajara, shared with me the racial remittances that her immigrant relatives in Atlanta had communicated, saying, well, the people would say we need to be very careful with Blacks because they're dangerous and like to fight and everything. Did my relatives tell me that Blacks did something to them? No, nothing. But among them it was said to be careful with them. It was a warning, perhaps. So Carla's quote, although it is in reference to Atlanta, respondents with immigrant contacts in various regions of the US share these similar narratives. And underlying this stereotypical portrayal of Blacks as aggressive is the warning that immigrants are or should be cautious of Blacks. And notice here that Carla's family didn't actually have any personal experiences with a Black person that resulted in any kind of violence or physical contact. but rather I found that these racial remittances are operated largely as transnational immigrant narratives that need not be based on direct personal encounters. And this is important. I'll tell you 2 slides later. Okay, so in the absence, to summarize, in the absence of meaningful interactions with blacks in the Mexican context, and the marginalization of the African element in Mexican nationalist ideologies and discourses of race, Mexicans' racialized views of blacks are largely informed by these racial remittances that transmit dominant US racial discourse of blacks as aggressive, criminal, and prone to violence. So what I'm arguing here is that racial remittances are a key mechanism that help to explain the existing patterns that we see in the literature for immigrants' preference to maintain social distance from blacks upon arrival. And what I actually do in the next chapter of my dissertation is then analyze the interviews with immigrants in 2 different regions of Los Angeles, so 2 different neighborhoods. So Southeast Los Angeles, which is predominantly Latino neighborhoods, and also in South LA, where Latinos are now the majority, but where there's a lot of contact and proximity to Black Americans. This is not part of my talk here, but in the future, I'll continue to develop this work where, I look at basically, so this part here sets up the argument that immigrants are coming in with these tales, these stories and messages to keep some kind of distance from blacks. And actually, when I did the interviews in Mexico, I asked about their perceptions of whites and any stories that they heard about race relations generally. And the racial remittances about whites were sort of split evenly between, whites are sort of the benevolent, they help immigrants, they're employers, they give jobs, but also increasingly messages about whites as anti-immigrant, racist, hostile toward undocumented immigrants, but those perceptions tended to be sort of split more between the 2, and so it makes this much more compelling, right? That the messages that are being relayed about African Americans specifically tend to be that of, oh, you're better off keeping your distance. So for the literature that is out there. And any of you can dig it up, and you find this the argument that immigrants, Latinos are keeping social distance from blacks, but immigrants in particular are the most anti-black, or sort of keeping distance from blacks. And here I'm trying to sort of fill in a piece of that puzzle to explain why this may be the case. However, once immigrants are in the U.S. And become incorporated, some of this starts to change, right? But what's important about this is that, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is my last slide, but just very quickly, some of the contributions to the literature is, examining race beyond the black-white binary. And I think that's why we're all here gathered today, is part of this larger endeavor, right? But also, like I said, looking at racial remittances and seeing the need for greater dialogue about the role of racial stereotypes and attitudes in possibly as a barrier to building Black and Latino, and specifically Latino immigrant coalitions for social justice and immigrant rights, economic rights. But also, it's contributing to this move as we, the U.S. is sort of transitioning into a majority-minority nation, this need to move to rethinking and reconceptualizing race and racialization from a transnational framework, right? Especially as the immigrant population, not only from Latin America, but Asia and other parts of the world, continues to increase. So I'll end it with that. Thank you all.
Sylvia. Thanks, Casey. We'll now be opening up the floor for questions.
Hello, thank you both, Casey and Sylvia, for the really good talks and walks through your research. My question is addressed for Sylvia in particular. So, in David Fitzgerald's 2008 book, A Nation of Immigrants, he talks about this sort of way in which, like, the Mexican nation kind of has tapped into a lot of its immigrants in the United States, and how, towards the end of the book, he talks about this idea of how culture circles back from some of the returnees, and how that actually influences perceptions of the United States and also immigrant culture in general. And part of that was talking about some of the younger individuals that came back with what were perceived as kind of negative influencing culture from the United States. Hip-hop music, shaved heads, gang culture, loosely defined, and how that was kind of largely viewed by some of the Mexicans as being very negative aspects of American culture. So I was wondering about that aspect of this kind of remittencing in some ways too, how maybe the cultural artifacts from the United States are deemed, even when not necessarily racialized, as being pejorative. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of divorced from just the idea of race in terms of blacks being a sort of vessel of kind of negative or threatening images, but also this idea of things that might be coded as being black but become more sort of Americanized, and about that as being a threat, or if you could talk about that sort of binary, especially as it pertains to maybe an age gap.
Yeah. That's actually a really interesting question. As you were asking it, I was thinking that I did ask about, do you watch American films? Do you have cable TV? Do you have access to, I was thinking sort of the hip-hop. The hip-hop culture here in the U.S. is exported globally and has a large influence on cultures all over the world. So I was kind of interested to see if that would come up. And you make a good point about age, because with the respondents that I interviewed, I actually, I limited the age to between 25 and 65. And the reason I did that, again, it was sort of a feature of the transnational research design, because in the US, I wanted to be able to interview immigrants that had grown up in Mexico. So 25 was a cutoff. So surprisingly, not too many people brought up, hip hop culture, and it could be because maybe, they didn't sort of access it as much as we would expect maybe youth to. But another interesting thing was that there was something of a gender sort of difference there, because a lot of the women, some worked, but there were also quite a few who were housewives, and they just tended to watch fewer movies. So the people who said yes, that they watch a lot of Hollywood films and were actually able to name specific films or actors like Will Smith and reference, tended to be some of the younger men in the sample. So unfortunately I can't, the hip hop thing, I also sort of kept an eye open for that, but it didn't come up very much in the sample. But I totally agree with you that definitely influences, perceptions of not just Black Americans, but sort of just hip hop culture, and it's racialized in quite different ways. I did ask about Obama, but I was going to say, but if anybody wants to know about that, you can ask. I did ask about Obama. I wanted to know if Mexicans, what they would say about the fact that the U.S. has its first Black president. And most, actually all, were overwhelmingly supportive of the fact that, it's good that the U.S., has a president that is not white. But then I also asked whether they believe that this would actually be good for the Mexican immigrant population in the U.S. And there, some people felt that, the fact that Obama is a person of color doesn't mean that, immigrants are going to have support in the White House or, have it better off. Or or even because I asked, or even that Obama would actually do much to increase sort of the opportunities for Black Americans. So maybe a little bit of cynicism there, perhaps. Yeah.
Next question.
Hi. I just had also a question for Sylvia Zamora. In your interviews, I was just wondering if the distinction between Blacks in Mexico versus Blacks in the US came up, how that came up, and then since you're talking about sort of racial remittances, I'm just wondering how it went the other way, in terms of, I don't know, how Mexicans made a distinction. These categories.
Yes, thank you for that question. So, you know, I came up with my interview protocol where I had certain language for, you know, how should I refer to Blacks in Mexico and Blacks in the US and even Afro-Latinos from Cuba or Brazil. So I did a couple of test runs, right, like sort of to test the interview protocol. I made a couple of changes. One thing I didn't want to do was impose US, you know, labels and classifications in Mexico. What was interesting is that in Mexico, I tried to be as specific as I could, both in Mexico and in the US. So when referring to Afro-Mexicans, because there's even debate in Mexico about what do Afro-descended Mexicans refer to themselves, right? And there's even a debate that, you know, is it a scholarly imposition to call them Afro-Mexicans? Do they refer to themselves as Black and whatnot? So I just describe them as Mexicanos Afrodescendientes. So Afro-descended Mexicans. In some cases, when people seem like they still kind of weren't getting it, then I would say Mexicanos de raza negra. So, you know, racially black Mexicans. When referring to Black Americans, I would say, and you know, it's interesting because even the term Afro-Americano, it's a US term. And so very few non-migrants were sort of privy to this term Afro-Americano as sort of like the politically correct term, right? In Mexico, it would be Negros Americanos. So I would say sometimes Negros Norteamericanos, just to be very sure that we're talking about North American Blacks. And then some would actually say, oh, Afro-Americanos, right? Mexicans also use the term Morenos to refer to Black Americans, but also to refer to dark-skinned Mexicans who otherwise wouldn't be identified as phenotypically Black, right? So referring to dark-skinned Mexicans. So that's why I avoided the term Moreno. I didn't use the term Moreno because it sort of has different meanings. But yes, but to answer your question, so I just did the best I could to specify sort of the region and sort of Afro-descendants in Mexico. And then when I did ask about Afro-Latinos, I always reference Celia Cruz because everybody knows and loves Celia Cruz. So then people would say, oh yes, she's Cuban. Yes, okay, and then sort of, you know, they would click.
Gaye?
I have a question for Casey. So you studied Los Angeles in a particular point in time, in a particular set of sort of economic relations, and a particular set of you studied Los Angeles at a particular point in time with a particular set of economic relations and a particular set of demographic relations. And Los Angeles today looks very different. And so I wonder if, on the basis of your historical examination, if you have insight into how you see the evolution of Black-brown relations in Los Angeles over the next 40 years rather than the last 40. Now I understand that that's a broad question, but surely you've thought about it. So.
Yeah, surely.
Like, don't call me Shirley.
No, that's actually a really good question, and it is something to think very critically about, right? If I'm looking at the 1960s and the 1970s, which is this moment in which you know, the African American movement for social justice is making strides and taking off in a sustained way, and the Mexican American movement is underway, and Mexican Americans are really working to define their racial identity in this moment. What does that mean for, you know, I stopped in 1980, what does that mean in post-1980 period? And so as Sylvia pointed out, Los Angeles, the area that, which I identify as historically African American space, has transformed significantly and is now majority, Mexican American. And one of the examples that people often cite is, right, the comparison between the footage of the Watts Rebellion of 1965 and the 1992 uprising, in which you see both black and brown people looting, stores in South Central LA. Very different, right? Completely different, and it's a representation of how the city has changed. And so one thing that I do think about is, well, what does it mean that, these sort of formerly majority black spaces are now highly Latino? What does that mean for black-brown relations? And also in terms of thinking about questions of intermarriage, of intermixing, how does that transform the way that Latinos understand themselves? How does that transform the way that they understand their relationship to African Americans? How has, South Central as a space been transformed politically? So those are some of the questions that I think about. Can I project how things would change? I can't project, but I know there are these significant and interesting transformations that are happening that I think we should pay attention to and compare and contrast how things are changing over time.
Court.
I also have a question for Casey. So one of the interesting things about your talk is it suggests that like the things that the federal government were doing, right, were setting the context for black-white relations. And so under a certain administration, right, their policies would produce a context that might facilitate or inhibit Latino African-American relations. So I guess I'm wondering, in the time period you use actually covers multiple administrations, right?
Yes.
Execute a war on poverty, and I suspect you probably pick up a little bit of the shift into this 80s era retrenchment of social worker programs. So I guess I'm wondering, to what extent do you find variation in Black-Latino relations depending on the administration, like who's in charge, and what the federal government is doing?
Testing. Does that work? Okay. No, that's a really good question. And as you point out, there is a change in administration. There's a change in sort of political culture. So there is a significant transformation that happened between 1964 and 1980, and the war on poverty as a set of federal programs entered the hands of various different presidents and officials over time. And so I would point out one of the significant changes I would think that occurs is that the way that what happens with the war on poverty after it leaves the hands of Johnson is that it's transferred into various different government agencies. So whereas the war on poverty was overseen by the Office of Economic Opportunity under Johnson, later on as more conservative officials start to sort of take over the federal government, then it's transferred to, the Department of Social Welfare, the Housing and Urban Development. So these various different agencies of the federal government then become responsible for different parts of the war on poverty, and it becomes sort of broken down as a result of, say, the backlash against welfare, say, right? And so then an emphasis made more so be on employment training rather than programs that provide funding to, create a program for youth or something like that. If it's a youth program, then maybe an employment training program. So there becomes this emphasis on individual rehabilitation as it relates to, creating programs to allegedly to put people into the employment system. And so I think that that's the more significant, probably the most significant shift that happens is when the war on poverty starts to be broken down and challenged, right, by sort of anti-welfare, people with an anti-welfare stance, and that this emphasis on employment and employment training becomes sort of like the backbone of any program that was once associated with the war on poverty.
And did it have any implications for Black-Brown relations, that shift from centralized program to fragmented and shifting focus to employment? Did that change relationship, or not causal,
Yeah.
but you know.
Not that I can see as of yet, but as I continue my dissertation research, I'll see if that comes up. But nothing that I can see as of now. But another shift that does happen over time, more toward into the 1970s as the war on poverty even further declined. Because after, probably after about the first few years, the program actually starts to decline. And that's when it is moved into various different agencies. But one shift is that, right, the Mexican Americans as a political force becomes more significant and increases. And so that also changes how the groups interact around the war on poverty. Say, for instance, Mexican Americans want to may engage with, for instance, the Civil Rights Act to claim that they're being neglected in programs that focus more on African Americans. So those are some of the shifts that you start to see later on in the 1960s.
Any more questions?
Just one quick question for Sylvia. Were you able to tell if the answers you got during this interview were somehow related with the level of education? Were you able to tell something there?
That's a good question. So, you know, I'll admit, this is one of the limitations of my study, is that I selected the sample based on people with less than a college education. And the reason why I did that, again, is because of, you know, the Mexican immigrant population in Los Angeles is, you know, I mean, Mexican migration is a migration of labor, and so we know that, you know, the population tends to have less than a college education in the U.S. So one of the first things that my committee had said to me was, you don't want to go to Mexico and interview highly educated people because these are not the same people that are migrating to the U.S. So I decided to, you know, limit it to so these are working class folks in my sample. One idea I do have for expanding the project into a book is to include highly educated, college educated, or highly educated Mexicans, because I think that there might be some differences in terms of education, and there have been other studies not looking at Mexicans, but I'm thinking of Wendy Roth, who did her study, similar sort of transnational study on Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, and she did find differences by education.
So you refer to them as working class migrating. So education is one thing, and class, you know, can you break that down a little bit more on how you define working class, people work?
Well, okay, maybe I should not have used the term. The actual way I describe it are people with less than a college education, and based on just limiting it by education, then most of the respondents who participated in my study tended to have working class occupations. And by this, it's people who don't own their own businesses, people who, you know, I have a short demographic survey where I asked for their income. I just haven't analyzed that as systematically, but definitely these are not people who are earning, you know, well, it's sort of different to compare it in Mexico and in the US. So generally I say working class, people who work in factories in Mexico. It might not answer your question.
I'm curious.
And were you referring to in Mexico or in
both?
LA?
Both. And when you say working class, does that mean someone who is at where they stand out and
You mean, are they all employed? Are they all working? Day laborer?
Yeah, day laborer. Is that in the U.S.? Is that? And then the limitation as to what neighborhoods they're allowed to come to in the United States.
Yeah. So
do they come with a green card or not recognized?
No. I actually left it open. So I didn't select on legal status. But what I ended up finding is that more than half of the respondents in LA were undocumented. And that included the long-term immigrants, and then obviously all of the recent immigrants were undocumented. There were a couple of day laborers who were in the recent immigrant sample. And I have to say, this group was really difficult to find and recruit and interview. You know, what we know about immigrants, especially undocumented, very recent immigrants, they want to avoid being seen and detected. So I was out there, man, you know, in the neighborhoods, I mean, just approaching people. Finally, I found the contact to work with a couple of day laborers. So I interviewed a couple of them, but I didn't want to have all of the sample consist of day laborers. So there are some of those included, and for the most part, their work, I mean, they were work, you know, not very temporary, couple of hours a week if they were lucky. There were about 2 people who actually were not in a home, didn't have a home, recent immigrants who had previously stayed in a shelter, but these are 2 out of the larger sample. But there were some housewives who technically were not employed, not in the labor market, but were married to men who were in the labor market, who worked as mechanics. One man worked in a bakery, construction work, grounds and maintenance, so janitorial work. Yeah, so those were some of the occupations.
Great. These are all wonderful questions. At this point, we'll be taking a 5-minute intermission, which will be followed by a talk by Professor Johnson and Professor Mark Sawyer. Thank you.
Thank you.